The current state of play of Universal Proxy. We're here today with Michael Levin, who's with the activistinvestor.com. He's been running that site for quite a while now. Michael has been a respected investor, corporate executive, management consultant for over 30 years, and he served on a number of boards, so he really knows his stuff. His stuff is really unique. You need to subscribe and read his blog today on realtransparentdisclosure.com. So, Michael, I've been following your stuff for years. The Activist Investor, it's such great stuff. Anyone who wants to get your communications should go to the activistinvestor.com and sign up.
Right.
How long have you been writing on that site, and what's your motivation?
I've been writing, maintaining that little website, blogging, and so forth, probably for 10, 15 years. You know, I've been doing activist stuff for probably a little more than 20. And you asked about motivation. So I created the website and, you know, do this blog and this weekly news digest and so forth, mostly to keep my mind sharp, but also to help elevate the level of discourse in the investor, activist, and company community. In particular, there's a ton of information, really good stuff available for boards and for company leadership. There's not quite as much available for that's kind of aimed at activists. So, or at least there wasn't early on. And so I kind of aimed to fill that gap a little bit to try to help shareholders understand, what some of their rights are, how to interact with companies in constructive ways, and so forth. So that's a little bit of the perspective that I bring and kind of why I do it. It's not like a for-pay newsletter or something. It's just something that I contribute to the overall community because it helps me think a little more clearly about what's going on.
And I find it so fascinating because it's not written by someone who's a corporate lawyer, which is most of the content I consume.
Yeah.
So it's much not only more interesting, but just as a fresh perspective on what's happening out there.
Thank you. I wanted to go to law school 45 years ago, but I never got around to it. So maybe that's kind of creeping out.
You're smart not to do so.
Right.
So let's talk about the current state of Universal Proxy. What does that look like right now?
Well, so we're now embarking on the second season of availability of Universal Proxy. Which, as most people know, was a fairly subtle and almost, routine mechanical change in how corporate board elections were run, which had all sorts of wide-ranging and interesting reverberations in how shareholders vote, in how activists think about structuring their proxy contests, how companies think about responding to investors who are doing this kind of thing. So it's still kind of early, if you will, although we have enough experience from at least last year and so forth we've seen this year to draw a couple of conclusions, or at least initial, fairly well-grounded observations. The first is it didn't quite bring out of the woodwork, so to speak, a lot of smaller or more inexperienced shareholders to try to pursue, ESG or single issue, whatever, proxy contest. There was one this year, finally, after this experience that in fact just got resolved, where the labor union that SEIU, the labor union that was trying to organize all the Starbucks locations, started a proxy contest and concluded it. Decided that for whatever reason, Starbucks had made enough progress in improving labor relations that they didn't need to run their 3 candidates. But that was really the only one we've seen so far. The other interesting observation is that there have been a much larger number of, if you will, settlements of proxy contests, where companies and shareholders agreed to essentially get to the point, let's figure out how to resolve this, rather than taking it to a final conclusion of a shareholder vote. And we did a little bit of research last year, and it's being borne out just anecdotally this year, that these settlements are happening a lot faster. They happen, if you kind of did the math on some of the days duration of some of these, with an admittedly small sample of contests, there's maybe, under 20 in a year in the US. They were settling like twice as fast. So it seemed that, companies and probably also shareholders, investors, we're not necessarily interested in testing the limits of what's possible with under universal proxy, and trying basically just to, let's move on from a fight. Let's move on for a debate about how this, and try to fix a company. And they wanted to do that a lot more quickly than they had in past years. And it's pretty clear that universal proxy helped that along. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because in the shareholder proposal arena, Rule 14A8, the level of withdrawn proposals is up this year, and that usually indicates that there was some sort of negotiated settlement for the proponent to withdraw it. So
Right.
that comports.
Well, and this actually gets to, an interesting development in universal proxy, which also is another observation which was borne out, is that universal proxy helped make proxy contests a lot more personal. Okay, that rather than voting shareholders just comparing like a company thesis to a activist plan, the mechanics and the logic of voting under universal proxy really allowed a much more direct comparison of individual candidates, and really, as I said, made it much more personal. So along those lines, if it's going to be that personal, if you're going to have an aggressive activist that's going to try to, make one or another director look not as good, to be generous, as an activist candidate, or really bad if you're really aggressive, you may want to avoid that kind of situation, and move on to, again, resolving it, and start to figure out what to do with the business. So, but that's a very important theme, that these proxy contests are becoming much more a direct comparison of a dissident's nominee or nominees to certain incumbents on the board of directors. Comparing qualifications, comparing experience, comparing temperament. There's all sorts of ways that comparison can go. And that really becomes very, critical to boards of directors in terms of how they, position their candidates, in terms of how they explain in proxy materials and other communication, how they explain their board's qualifications. And there's some things that, companies, and really activists too, can do better or worse in terms of trying to make those make that case much more clearly. So,
yeah, the human nature of that is definitely would be a big factor. I've heard even when all the directors get votes in support of their own candidacy in the high 90s, the fact that one director might have 98% support and the other has 97, the person with 97 is like, why?
Yeah, I've been on boards. I've served on, public company boards, and there was always that moment a week after the annual meeting when we're looking at the tabulated results, like, why did that guy do a little better than me? And so you kind of wonder, and within that range, it's usually kind of random, but then there's going to be some cases where some directors just don't do as well, and boards need to think hard about, are they positioning that candidate well, or is that candidate, not necessarily the best one for that board?
So, we have a limited sample size, but how would you rate the overall level of disclosures that companies are making during your universal
It's
proxy?
definitely improved. Okay. That's another outcome. Universal proxy, in part because of the personal nature of the campaigns, of the proxy contests. Companies have really, and this is also part of the need to engage more and better with shareholders just overall, but trying to really explain a couple of things in proxy materials and other disclosures, but this is primarily in proxy statements. trying to explain much more clearly a director's very specific, credentials, qualifications, background for the company, trying to show how that and trying to show how that fits with a strategy for the business. Connecting director candidates to the direction the business wants to go is really important. I've worked myself on activist projects where a dissident needs to do something similar, where an activist will have like a thesis, have some direction that the company wants to go. Maybe they want to focus on governance and capital allocation. I'm obviously inventing that right now. But then they need to kind of show not only that the candidates, the 2 or 3 or whatever number of challengers that the activist has nominated are just, good people and good for the business and so forth, but connecting them very directly to that, as I said, governance and capital allocation. I can even give an example here. I'll reach back to, actually it started last year, but it's this year, and it's our favorite Proxy situation this year, which of course is Disney and Trian. That's on everybody's mind. Okay. CEO Nelson Peltz of Trian nominated himself, and that was a statement and so forth. But the logic of universal proxy suggests that a dissident needs to identify specific incumbents to kind of run against, if you will. And at the time, Peltz and even today decided to, so to speak, run against Disney director by the name of Michael Froman, who is a distinguished public servant, worked in the Foreign Service and so forth. But according to Peltz, really didn't have much in the way of public company board experience, which is true. Froman's service on the Disney board is his first board, essentially after retiring from public service and doing a couple of other private sector roles. But that was very consistent with Trian's thesis for the company, which is that Disney's corporate governance and succession planning and so forth needs to improve. And again, I'm not really commenting about who's right here. I'm just observing that Trian nominated Peltz to make specific improvements in governance and focused on a Disney director that they claim was weakest in terms of kind of core corporate governance competencies. So linking a candidate, linking an incumbent back to what a company is trying to do with the business, the direction they want to go, and disclosing that in succinct but sufficient detail to reach shareholders that have a lot of these to think about, is something that that companies and also activists really should do very well. I know this is kind of a long answer to the question, but again, linking candidate and incumbent credentials to a thesis, to a plan in very specific ways is something that can really help.
And what about the disclosures made by activists? How do they stack up against what companies are doing?
It's not as it's improving. Part of the problem is that companies, routinely, have an annual or more frequent, need to disclose and to describe, candidate capabilities and so on and so forth. Activists and dissidents and so forth, some do it pretty routinely, but most, do proxy contests and so forth. And we're talking in the context of universal proxy, not that often. And they also sometimes tend to get wrapped up in more of criticism and even a little bit of ire directed at a company, rather than a more dispassionate, objective, description of candidate qualifications and kind of the why, why this candidate is appropriate for this particular slate, and again how it fits into a company, a dissident's plan and thesis for their portfolio company. So
And then the mission of this real transparent disclosure.com site is more
Yeah, yeah,
transparent disclosure. What can both sides do? You think that is
yeah,
a better job?
yeah. I've long been an advocate that particularly companies would benefit not from necessarily, more, a lot more detailed disclosure, if you will, and here we're talking boards and so forth. But I'm a big fan of better access to directors. Okay. There's companies that, pretty much, larger ones and so forth that are very confident in their ability of a director maybe to talk to individual investors and shareholders. But I think just being, much more confident in directors' ability to talk one-on-one with a number of shareholders. For a board to be able to say, hey, I'm going to take the top 25 shareholders, and we're going to kind of assign directors one-to-one, um, and disclose to those shareholders, here's how you can get to our director, here's how the person, you can call him, here's how you can answer questions. This director can help set up meetings if you're kind of curious, if you're a portfolio manager, and so on and so forth. And really having a company have directors, bear some, not necessarily responsibility, but you may be responsibility for some of that shareholder contact. Now that's something that may, bother a general counsel, unfortunately, or something where they say, "Oh, we can't do that." But to be able to have the confidence in directors that, that they're really empowered to be able to talk to shareholders a little more, one-on-one in a personal way, I think really helps, and especially helps if a company finds themselves in an activist situation. Um, if you already have had, your board in touch with the top, few dozen shareholders, it's going to make it really hard for those shareholders to look negatively and to try to even vote against some of those directors if they've already kind of established this personal relationship. That's kind of what I'm saying. Disclosing how a personal relationship can kind of evolve here, I think it would be something that boards of directors and companies could really benefit from. And that's a step beyond what they've already been able to do. But for a forward thinking, visionary, kind of progressive thinking board or company, that would really pay off. I think I'm talking as a shareholder.
Yeah, and you see that model with, I mean, it's different nonprofit boards, but especially when a nonprofit that needs fundraising, having the right board members that have a lot of
Yeah.
contacts really
Oh yeah.
off.
Right.
So that is
Exactly.
a
Having the
total.
directors, a personal relationship between directors and key. And look, it can't be every share. I mean, you don't want, directors to have to, spend a lot of time talking to someone who owns 100 shares. I mean, that's obviously, but there's going to be, even outside the big three, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, there's the top 50, 60, whatever, funds out there that still own a tremendous amount of stock. And for those directors to create that kind of personal relationship with the portfolio manager, with the stewardship teams, and so forth, for that director to say, here's my cell phone number if you guys want to call me and ask questions, that would be, I think that would really help to kind of cool things down, to to allow shareholders to kind of get questions answered, allow the directors to make a case about why a company's doing certain things. That would be a real innovation, and as a shareholder myself, as an investor, I would welcome that.
So one of my favorite parts about reading the
Yeah,
content that you write on the Activist Investor is
yeah,
following the actual universal proxy contests
sure,
and other
yeah.
things that happen. So, it's early days, but what's the strangest thing that you've seen
Well,
so far?
there's been a couple of real interesting cases. One of them that was it's a little technical, but it was really kind of interesting. So there was a proxy contest last year with a little small cap company called Zevra, ZVRA, Zevra Pharmaceutical. And I was kind of tracking because I was kind of interested in how actual voting outcomes of proxy contests worked. And an activist investor started running a proxy contest there, and the guy was Mangus. I can't remember the guy's name, but he was an individual investor. He's a car dealer in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and he ran this proxy contest. He spent, according to his disclosure, spent a couple $100,000. It's classified board, so he, I think he ran 3 candidates for 3 seats in the class. The proxy advisors is recommended to Zevra shareholders that they vote only for the incumbents, vote against this guy Mangus. He instead, sort of in a minimalist contest, got in touch with a whole bunch of institutions himself and did a social media campaign, and won, I think, either 2 or all 3 of his seats, like 2-1, by this unbelievable margin. And in fairness, this company wasn't doing so well, so there were some probably unhappy shareholders. But this was like guerrilla warfare in proxy contests and activist investing, and it was for portfolio managers that really want to do things kind of frugally, or do things kind of quietly. This was one that was just interesting, and I haven't talked to any of the parties on this. His attorney on this was a small regional firm that really didn't do a whole lot. I think it was a tiny corporate department. His proxy solicitor, no one knew. I talked to every proxy solicitor that I know, and I said no one knew the person. It was like a 2-man firm, and he was able to win this. It was really curious. At some point, I'm going to dig a little deeper and sort of figure out what really happened here. But that was a real example of how universal proxy can really empower a resourceful activist investor to do some things that maybe weren't possible before. So,
Well, fascinating.
yeah.
Well, thank you, Michael, for your expertise.
Sure. This is great.
Try to do an annual check-in and find out what happens.
Yeah, it's a be interesting year so far. There's probably a slightly larger number of contests this year, at least based on what I've been kind of tracking, and the ones I've been involved in and so forth. But already they're starting to settle, so it might be kind of quiet again. We'll have to see. We can sort of check in a couple months and sort of see how it's starting to work out.
Okay, thanks very much.
Take care.